everybody, and welcome back to my channel. So today's video is a nightmare, and that's honestly the best way that I can describe today's video. It is something that's so sickening and heartbreaking and confusing and frustrating, and when you hear the circumstances of this case and how the case played out and progressed and what happened in the end and where we are today, you're going to be shocked and infuriated. This case honestly reminds me a lot of a whole bunch of other cases that I've covered mixed together, which at first was really alarming for me and confusing when I was going through the information. It all seemed so very familiar, and it's a lot of cases that you guys have specifically been incredibly upset about and not understood. So just prepare that throughout this video you are likely going to be angry. There's a lot of upsetting information in this video, so that's just a little warning for you guys. So today we're going to be talking about the strange disappearance of Jaliek Rainwalker. Jaliek was a 12-year-old little boy that went missing on November 1st, 2007 from Greenwich, New York. Now, please, while you listen to his situation and how he was as a young child, try not to cast much judgment without hearing everything. I know that there are going to be people that make a lot of opinions off of the things that I tell you, but just go into this with an open mind and a lot of understanding. So Jaliek's childhood was incredibly tough from the start, and I'm talking from when he was in the uterus. That is when his problems really all began. His mother used cocaine and alcohol throughout the entire pregnancy with him, and because of that, he was born addicted to cocaine and really struggling from the second he was born. Now, I'm not exactly sure when he was placed up for adoption or put into the foster system. I'm not exactly sure if they took him away from his biological parents. I'm not sure if he spent any time with his biological parents. There's not a lot of clear information out there about that. I do know he had two half-brothers that throughout his life lived in Albany, New York. But either way, he ended up being placed in the foster system. But he wasn't placed in a normal foster system. He was actually in a therapeutic foster system because of the severity of his trauma from being born addicted to cocaine and because of the emotional problems that gave him, along with his early childhood. He ended up being bounced around between 6 different foster homes from the time he was put into the therapeutic foster care system and the time that he disappeared. And all these parents knew that they were taking in a child with severe special needs. But unfortunately, his behavior was just too much for majority of these foster parents to handle. While Jaliek was a very intelligent and kind person, he suffered from something called reactive attachment disorder. So basically what this means is that Jaliek was not capable of really forming any sort of attachment or relationship to anyone, and this usually stems from severe neglect as a child. You can suffer from this if you weren't given your basic needs, whether that's food and water, a safe place to live, or it could be emotional needs. You're not given love, you're not really given any sort of attachment to learn from and grow from. And children who are affected by this disorder, they just can't form these bonds with people. They often don't smile. They don't interact with anybody. They won't ask you for help. They won't ask you for comfort. And if you do show them comfort, they just don't react to it at all because they don't know how to. They won't play interactive games with you. They just struggle a lot. And when you suffer with something like that, it can make you very angry because it's frustrating because you don't understand social situations. You don't understand a lot of different social cues. So you get angry, you get upset, you don't understand why you don't understand things. And because of this, it really triggered a lot of aggressive temper tantrums. And all of these temper tantrums are what ended up moving Jaliek from one foster home to another. Now, Jaliek's previous foster home, before he ended up with his very last foster family, he was actually going to be adopted by this family. Unfortunately, after about 4 years of living with this family, he had an outburst where he ended up attacking their younger daughter, and because of this, they didn't feel it was safe for him to be in the home anymore, and these outbursts would last around an hour at a time, and nothing could console him, so they ended up removing him from the home. Now, after being removed from this home in 2002, he went to the home of Jocelyn McDonald and Stephen Kerr in rural Washington County, New York. Now, the couple had 3 biological sons and they had 1 daughter that they adopted, and the ages at the time of Jaliek's disappearance ranged from 8 to 14 years old. And it was a very interesting transition for Jaliek because this family lived a very, very non-traditional lifestyle. So they lived in a very rural area, as I said before, but they also only lived in what you can consider maybe a cabin. It was only 2 rooms in the entire home. There were really no doors within the home. There was no running water. They all slept in the exact same room together, and I'm talking 7 people in the exact same room together. There was only electricity for a couple of hours a day that was running off of a generator, and there were no bathrooms inside the house. There was only an outhouse. And an average person would have a lot of trouble adjusting to this sort of lifestyle, but for someone like Jaliek and his special needs, it really affected him. Imagine having issues making relationships and understanding people and being around people, and then being forced to only be around people. He had no place to go to calm down when he was overwhelmed by everyone. But despite his temper tantrums, he still enjoyed being in this family from what everyone could tell on the outside. And there were still good moments. And they ended up adopting him as their own child in 2004. So just 2 years after they took him in as a foster child. But eventually, Jaliek's behavior began to get out of hand. Jaliek continued with his outbursts, but it got to the point where he ended up threatening one of the children in the homeschooling group. From there, he ended up having a period where he was very suicidal, he was very homicidal, and they weren't giving him proper treatment for any of his medical conditions. He wasn't seeing a therapist, he wasn't on any medication. This information to me is honestly very upsetting because we all have talked about the foster system and adoption before, and it is so incredibly difficult for your average person to adopt or foster a child. But somehow this foster system put this young man that had severe special needs into a home that did not fit the type of lifestyle he needed. They didn't make sure he was being seen by a doctor constantly to work on his different mental disorders. He wasn't on any medication. I really don't understand how anyone let this go. I don't understand how they had the ability to foster him and then after that adopt him. But either way, he just wasn't being given the treatment that he needed, and he was not in a situation that would allow him to thrive. So he just regressed constantly. So because of all of this that had been happening right before Jaliek disappeared, his parents ended up calling a crisis hotline. This is how bad it got, and they said he was absolutely unmanageable and they wanted to reverse the adoption process. But at this point, according to the crisis worker, there was no way to dissolve this adoption process. They couldn't take this adoption back. They had nowhere to send him really. They couldn't come and take him. And they said the best bet that they had was to try respite care instead. And if you're not aware of what respite care is, basically when you have situations where it's either a live-in caretaker for someone with special needs, or you're working with foster children or adoption, anything along those lines, and you're struggling a lot with the process, there are other families that kind of are on this list. And if you're struggling, they can take the child or the young adult for a certain period of time to kind of give that individual a little bit of a break to better their mind and to give you a little break so you can be the best parent that you can be. And this is the best option that they had. So considering it was their only option, they took this up immediately. So Jaliek, after this call was made, was taken to one of his prior foster parents' home, and they kept him from October 23rd or 24th of 2007 until November 1st. Now, he apparently was in great spirits while he was in this home. So this kind of shows you how he must have been feeling while he was living with Jocelyn and Steven. He had a great time there. He was much more relaxed. There weren't as many outbursts as he normally had, and he was actually scheduled to go back to their home the following weekend. And he told the foster parents in this temporary respite home that he was so excited to come back, that he had a great time, and then he was handed over to Steven. Now, they didn't have anywhere for Jaliek to go that day or that night. They only had something set up for the following morning for the next week, and then he was again going back to that other family for the weekend. So this meant that Steven and Jocelyn had no choice but to take care of Jaliek that night. Now, Jocelyn and the children didn't want anything to do with Jaliek because they considered him a massive threat. So they stayed at their cabin, and Steven took Jaliek to his father's house. Now, his father's house was a couple miles away, but his father was out of the country, so it'd just be Jaliek and Stephen. And this seemed like the perfect setup. It wouldn't aggravate Jaliek. It wouldn't hopefully cause any more outbursts. The children would be safe. Jocelyn would be safe. It would be a much better situation until they could get him to his next respite home. Now, they seem to have a pretty average and good night. Stephen actually took Jaliek out to dinner around 8 p.m. at Red Robin. A manager confirmed they were there at that time, as well as a waitress. And then immediately after this, they went back to Stephen's father's home. Now, this is where situations get very, very cloudy. Stephen doesn't remember an exact time that either of them went to bed. He just said Jaliek went to bed pretty much right away, said goodnight, went off, went to sleep, and he said he went to bed shortly after and was asleep the entire night until about 7:30 in the morning.
Stephen says on the ride back he wanted Jaliek to apologize to his family.
Somewhere in Easton, I mentioned to him that he was going to have to get together with a group of children who he had seriously damaged his relationship with. And then he didn't say another word. When we arrived here, I asked him to go to bed. I don't even think he said goodnight.
Now, Stephen woke up at 7:30 that morning and he looked over and it looked like Jaliek was in bed. But when he went over to check on him, he realized Jaliek was nowhere to be found, and it appeared like Jaliek had taken clothes and pillows and stuffed his comforter to make it look like he was there, but he simply wasn't. Now, if you woke up to your child missing, that's a giant alarm. And Stephen said that he searched the entire house and couldn't find him. He said that his duffel bag wasn't there, his stuffed animal that he loved wasn't there, none of his clothes were there, and he said there was also no money or credit cards taken from the home. It's almost like Jaliek had just disappeared. Now, you would expect a parent to immediately call authorities in this moment. However, that's not what Stephen chose to do. Stephen instead decided to take a shower first and then ride into town where he returned a couple of movies, and then he came back and he didn't call Jaliek in as missing until 8:57, an hour and a half after he realized Jaliek was missing. When authorities arrived, Stephen told them all about Jaliek, all about his behavior, all about his past. He told them what they did the night before and that he couldn't find any of Jaliek's belongings, so Jaliek must have run away. But when authorities went to search everything, they ended up finding all of those items in the garage. They found the duffel bag that was filled with all of his clothes. They found his stuffed animal. So the only thing missing was now Jaliek. Because of Jaliek's past behavior, Stephen really suggested the fact that he'd either run away because he was tired of being thrown from home to home, or since Jaliek was suicidal, he said it was likely Jaliek left to end his life. So authorities decided to extensively search the areas at both of the houses. So they searched Stephen's father's home and they searched the family's cabin. When I say extensive, I am not exaggerating. There were helicopters, there were canine units, there were dive teams, forest rangers, tons of different search and rescue teams. They even searched both of the homes as if they were a crime scene just in case. And that's not something that's very common. Often when you look into cases that it's assumed this person's run away, they refuse to treat situations like a crime scene because that's not their direction of thinking at the moment, and usually that's why everyone's kicking themselves in the end, is because that was never done. But they really did cover every single one of their bases in this situation, but they weren't able to find anything. They even decided to go and reach out to different religious groups in the area that might possibly have taken him in, or maybe he was out running around and needed some place of refuge, but they had never seen him, never heard of him. He was nowhere. And within a few days of Jaliek being missing, authorities were able to announce that they believed Jaliek met with foul play. He was just a young boy. He was only 12 years old. The sheriff said that within his 30 years of working on the police department, there had never been a child that ran away that didn't turn up unless foul play was actually involved. So they were able to rule out that Jaliek simply ran away, and they were able to rule out that he ended his own life. Now, how they ruled this out, I have absolutely no idea. I cannot find information on that anywhere online. And for those to be so directly ruled out, there has to be something that they have that they're holding to themselves. As a normal investigation goes, they decided to look to the people closest to Jaliek, which would be Jocelyn and Stephen, his adoptive parents. The parents really stuck with their story of what happened and that they had absolutely nothing to do with Jaliek's disappearance, that he likely ran away. They even came up with a bunch of other different scenarios and ideas as to why he left. One of their ideas was that Jaliek left to live with an African American family because Jaliek was biracial, but he identified as an African American. He always wanted to know a lot more about that side of him, so they believed he just had enough of them and went to go experience something different. But they had no answers as to how he would have found some random African American family that would take him in. They just seemed to have this idea. They also had an idea that he left to be in a gang, but again, there was no evidence as to why they would believe this either, because Jaliek was homeschooled in a rural area that barely had electricity and had no running water. How would he have ever had any contact with anyone that potentially would have been in a gang? How would he even have been able to really look up information on gangs? Keep in mind, he had been living with this family from 2002. He disappeared in 2007. He didn't have a lot of exposure to the outside world in that time frame. He was only 7 years old when he left his previous foster home. So this as well didn't make a lot of sense. There was also an idea that he maybe went to reunite with his half-siblings in Albany, New York, but he hadn't seen them in 2 years or spoken to them in 2 years. So he wouldn't have known where to go. He wouldn't have known if they were even in the same locations. He would have had no way to get to them. And then the fact that Stephen decided to take a shower and run errands before reporting Jaliek missing, yet he also said it was possible that Jaliek went to end his life. You know, if you're concerned and your first idea is that, oh, my son might have killed himself, then, you know, why would you take a shower? Why would you wait? If you thought he just ran away and came back, you know, maybe I can see him waiting, potentially, giving Jaliek some space to calm down and come back. But he was like, oh yeah, it's a huge possibility he killed himself. So why didn't you have any concern about that in an hour and a half before reporting him? So because of all of this odd information, they really dug deep into Jocelyn and Stephen, and they asked them both to take a polygraph. Now, Jocelyn did take a polygraph, but Stephen refused, and from the moment that he refused, he immediately got a lawyer, and since that day, years ago, since 2007, he has not spoken to police. He also refused to give them a DNA sample. Now, take that with a grain of salt. Again, that does not mean he is guilty of anything. Polygraphs are not a reliable source of information. There are many ways that someone could be falsely incriminated based on this. So while it is odd, it doesn't mean there's anything going on there. But to add to the odd circumstances surrounding Stephen and Jocelyn, the family that Jaliek had been with the week prior in the respite home came forward about a letter that was supposedly left behind by Jaliek when he went missing. So all of his items remained and there was no sign of Jaliek, but Stephen did find a letter in the home that said, "Dear everybody, I'm sorry for everything. I won't be a bother anymore. Goodbye, Jaliek." Now, this was the only bit of evidence they had indicating where Jaliek was going, what happened to him, and from the looks of it, it appeared as if Jaliek had in fact ran away. But this family called out this letter immediately. According to them, this letter was not a goodbye letter whatsoever. They thought Jaliek had actually written this letter while at their home. So while Jaliek was at this family's home, he told them that Stephen, his adoptive father, had given him a homeschooling homework assignment. It stemmed from the fact that he had threatened this young boy in the homeschooling group. The assignment Stephen had given Jaliek was to write a letter, and in this letter, he was supposed to apologize to the people he had harmed. So let me read that letter to you one more time. "Dear everybody, I'm sorry for everything. I won't be a bother anymore. Goodbye, Jaliek." He told his foster parents that he was supposed to write a letter apologizing to everybody, and they actually watched him write this. Now, the one downfall of this is that the foster family didn't actually read the letter afterwards, so there was no way to 100% confirm that this was the exact letter he had written at their home. But the one thing really throwing authorities off was the fact that it said goodbye. It wasn't just, I'm sorry I hurt everybody, I won't do it again, I won't bother you anymore, Jaliek. It said goodbye, and that seemed like something that would be a little strange to write for this homework assignment, but you have to keep in mind he was only 12 years old. You kind of write whatever you think you're supposed to write to end a letter, and you don't necessarily think about the context of it. So at this point, most of Jaliek's prior foster parents banded together in an attempt to find him. Despite being a troubled child, it was just that. He was just a child that severely needed help and really wasn't put in the best opportunities to receive received that help. It was a situation he was born in. It was a disorder that stemmed from how he was treated as a child. It's not something that he chose. So these prior foster parents, along with Jaliek's maternal grandmother and I think maternal grandfather, all banded together to put effort into this website to raise any sort of awareness for Jaliek's case. And on this website, they gave constant updates, they had all sorts of information, and eventually the family that Jaliek had been with the week prior even came out saying that they believed Stephen had harmed Jaliek. So at this point, authorities, Jaliek's prior foster parents, even Jocelyn's family believed that there was something wrong with his story and that they somehow were involved in some way, shape, or form, or they knew more information than they were giving authorities. So by January of 2008, Stephen was labeled a person of interest based on a lot of contradictions that they were able to uncover from his story. So the timeline of the night, the best we know it, is that at 8 they went to dinner and then they went home. Jaliek immediately went to bed, and then according to Stephen, he went to bed shortly afterwards and did not leave the house, did not wake up until 7:30 a.m. the following morning. However, they were able to triangulate his location on his cell phone, and they found out that he was out around midnight that night, a time where he claimed he was actually sleeping.
That's Barbara Reilly, the mother-in-law of Stephen Kerr and the mother of his wife, Jocelyn. She tells me they don't have a relationship anymore. Like Chief Bell, she has questions about inconsistencies in the story told by Kerr. Why, for instance, this tower relayed a signal from his cell phone if he was nowhere near it. That tower is right across the street from this business. It's where Barbara and her husband just moved in. It's also right down the street from the Hudson River. And one police officer told Barbara this is a notorious dumping spot for bodies.
They wanted to back this up in some way, shape, or form, or figure out where exactly he was, what might have been going on. So they looked through surveillance footage, and they ended up also seeing a van that matched the exact color, make, model description of the family's van driving on Main Street. But the only issue is that they didn't catch a license plate, so they couldn't for sure say this was the family car, and they also couldn't tell who was inside it, so they also couldn't say for certain that it was in fact Stephen. But it matched up with the cell phone triangulation, and it was at a time where Stephen had claimed he was home. So at this point, Stephen is looking incredibly suspicious, and being the last and only person with Jaliek, authorities were desperately trying to find any information they could to figure out if he was possibly responsible. And then something very, very bizarre happened. Weeks after Jaliek's disappearance, a typed letter arrived at the home of Jocelyn and Stephen, and it was stamped as coming from Westchester. Now, they weren't sure if this was Westchester, a neighborhood that's apparently in, I think, Brooklyn or the Bronx. They didn't know if it was Westchester County. There was a whole lot of confusion about it, and they worked hand in hand with USPS to try to figure out where exactly it came from. I'm pretty sure the FBI was in on it. Now, they've not released any information on if they were able to find that out, but what the letter said is so incredibly strange. So before I get into this letter, just know it doesn't really make sense. It's a lot of jumbled words, a lot of misspelled words, but it said, Jaliek is still alive, needed a foot soldier for this war on drugs. Picked him up on Route 40 post 30. He's okay, no fake. He asked his mama and papa, who are the Marconi family? My cat named Diamond? Why does Franti yell fire? Don't try to look, we are not there. Now that doesn't sound like a jumbled mess of confusion. I have no idea what does. Now, while this letter doesn't make a lot of sense, it raised a lot more questions to authorities because there were some interesting bits of information in it. For example, needed a foot soldier for this war on drugs. That supports the family's idea that he possibly ended up in a gang, which is backed by pretty much nothing. And then there's my cat named Diamond, and Jaliek did in fact have a cat named Diamond. And then the phrase, why does Franti yell fire, actually stems from a rap song that came out that year. Now, I've looked at the lyrics. I don't understand them, if I'm being honest. According to some people, it's about a biracial man that wanted to understand his African American side more. I don't know if people created that out of it because that's something that the family suggested, but personally I don't get that from the lyrics. I could also be really naive on it. And then the portion where it said picked him up on Route 40 made a little bit of sense because where the home was located, where he was last seen, was right off Main Street, kind of, which is the last street that it's thought Stephen was on, but it would have been a straight shot up Main Street and then a jump over to 40, which was kind of like a highway. So it did have a lot of information in there that had a lot to do with the case. So authorities believed that either Jaliek wrote this, someone that had spoken to Jaliek wrote this, or someone in the family had to have written this. And because of their questions on this letter, paired with the questions they already had about Stephen, they decided to get another warrant to search Stephen's father's house, but mainly to search a computer and a printer within the home. So they believed it was a high possibility that this computer and printer could have been used to write and print off this letter, and Stephen likely was the one who did it. And they wanted to see if there was any sort of file saved within the computer, and they also wanted to look at the printer, because I don't know much about printers, but apparently some printers have a chip in them that store information of what it's printed after a certain amount of time. And since this letter had just been printed, if the printer did have a chip in it, it likely would reprint the letter had someone gone in and tried to find it. And then on top of that, they looked at the letter itself, and printers can be very, very unique. They can leave very specific streaks on the paper. Sometimes they have a very specific amount of ink that's released when it's printed. There's just a lot of technical information that I didn't know existed when it came to printers, and they were looking for anything that indicated this letter could have been printed at his father's home. Unfortunately, they weren't able to prove or disprove that idea. And Jocelyn and Stephen ended up infuriated over the fact that this search was held, and within days of the search happening, they filed a suit against the department saying that they had been illegally detained, wrongfully searched, that they were being accused of something that hadn't been done. They basically were just so angry about this.
I'm not privy to much of the investigation because the police are still working on the assumption, partially, that I did something wrong.
Jocelyn was pretty much forthright with us all the time. Stephen was hit or miss, but, then stopped communicating, hire an attorney. This is your kid that's missing.
But the case did not slow down. They kept trying to find new information. They kept looking into every single possibility because it was very obvious to everyone something was not right here. Jaliek did not just run away. And Jaliek's adoptive maternal grandmother, Barbara, who was a part of the website and was communicating with the foster parents to try to figure everything out, she was very active in the case, and she also was infuriated. She knew something was going on. Right after he disappeared, she actually tried to gain custody of Jaliek because she felt like Jocelyn and Stephen were not handling their missing son properly and that he had really been failed by them. But unfortunately, this change of custody was not granted. She seemed very infuriated with the situation and not very trusting of her daughter and son-in-law's story. So in July of 2008, she took matters into her own hands and ended up breaking into their home to try to find any information that she could. Now, she did in fact get charged with burglary, but she also was able to give information to authorities from the situation that pushed them to look into the house one more time. When authorities got the warrant and searched the home again, they ended up finding a yellow fleece sweatshirt. Now, why this sweatshirt was so important was because this was the same sweatshirt that both Stephen and Jocelyn claimed Jaliek was wearing the night that he disappeared. When the news was talking about the case, when authorities were talking about the case, the pictures that have been given to authorities, it was this same sweatshirt. This is the sweatshirt everyone was looking for to find Jaliek, but somehow it was in the family's home. And Barbara didn't stop airing out information there either. She ended up telling the media that Stephen suffered pretty severely with aggression. He had a lot of anger management problems and he had been going to counseling for them, but he wasn't making a lot of progress. Jocelyn actually kicked him out of the home 1 or 2 times for month-long periods because of how bad his aggression was getting towards the children. And this happened in 2007, the exact same year that Jaliek went missing. Now, Stephen wasn't just getting angry at all of the children. He was being aggressive towards all of them. He was being very angry, but he was particularly aggressive towards Jaliek. Barbara said she could really prove this with one instance that she witnessed. Apparently, one day in particular, Jaliek was being a little bit difficult, and Stephen got so frustrated and angry at him that he dragged him outside and repeatedly dunked him as punishment in the river. And apparently, that was a common thing. If Jaliek was going to be punished, he was punished in disgusting ways. He was dunked in the river, he was denied use of the outhouse, all sorts of horrific things. But Jocelyn was so upset and distraught over the fact that that's how Stephen was treating Jaliek that she forced him to write an apology letter to Jaliek, and then made him do all of Jaliek's chores for a month. Now you can only imagine how angry this might have made him. He already had a lot of anger management issues according to Barbara, but then on top of that, being forced to do the chores of the same person that made you so upset to begin with, and having to write a letter apologizing to them, especially a child, this might have made him incredibly angry. Now, there have been many reported sightings of Jaliek since he disappeared, and they've all been followed up, and every single one of them has been ruled out. There have been a few sets of remains found in the surrounding areas up to about 2 hours away, and they've all been thought to potentially be Jaliek, but every single one of them has been ruled out. Just months after Jaliek's disappearance, Jocelyn and Stephen moved to Rupert, Vermont with the whole family. They already hadn't spoken to Barbara since the first few days when Jaliek went missing, and now they've just cut off total communication, and they already wouldn't speak to authorities anymore. They just wanted nothing to do with anyone that was still involved with the search.
If you did nothing wrong, if you have nothing to hide, why don't you cooperate with law enforcement to help find your son?
In the past 10 years, Barbara had only called the family 4 times. All times to tell Jocelyn something very important, such as her grandmother was ill a few times, and then the time that her grandmother passed away. And from those 4 sparse calls over 10 years, it made Jocelyn and Stephen so uncomfortable that they threatened her with a stalking charge. Barbara has been so frustrated by their response to Jaliek going missing that she has just really kept on airing information out. According to Barbara, on the day that Jaliek went missing, the day he was reported, not only did Stephen nonchalantly shower and go run errands, but once he was reported missing, after a statement was given, after everything was done, everyone else, prior foster parents, other people in the family, were printing out posters. They were out there physically searching. Stephen attended a birthday party of his boss. Stephen didn't even go out that day to help search or print posters. There has not been a single day following Jaliek's disappearance that Jocelyn or Stephen have called to inquire about the status of his case. George Bell, the sheriff that has been on this case from the very beginning, has even told them that he understands if they feel they were wrongly focused on and if they're uncomfortable talking to his police department, and he has told them he is more than willing to have them call other departments, like whole other departments, to inquire about the status of Jaliek if they feel too uncomfortable to speak to their particular department, because he never wants a family to feel like they cannot have updates about a case on their missing son. But even with this offer put out on the table, they still haven't called. They've never taken up these offers. They just don't seem interested at all in knowing what's happening. This just added fuel to the fire that they knew more than they let on, and authorities have said this, as well as the foster parents and Jaliek's grandmother. They moved away from the one place Jaliek would have known to go back to, and usually you see the opposite. How many times have we covered cases where the family has remained in the house for years, or at least kept ownership of the house in case their loved one comes back? Jocelyn and Stephen have told their attorney to this day they believe Jaliek will come home. And if they truly believe that, you wouldn't expect months after his disappearance that they would leave. George Bell, who is the police chief that gained his notoriety from the work on Jaliek's case, ended up passing away earlier this year. This man had not missed a single workday in his entire 30+ year career. He was so incredibly dedicated to this case and finding the answers, and he worked on it all the time. Barbara has stated that he was the only person that kept her from falling apart. Whenever she came to him with an idea, whenever anyone called him with an idea, he never dismissed anything. He looked into every single possible sighting. He was always the first to jump if remains were found. He wanted to know, is it Jaliek? He submitted everything he possibly could to get it ruled out or confirmed as soon as possible. He put his all into this entire case. He was the one that had the case changed to a homicide investigation in 2012. He hoped doing this would allow him access to a lot more resources, and hopefully they would be able to probe a little bit deeper into some of the ideas that they originally had. And since he passed away, a lot of people close to the case are concerned that nobody will ever have the chance to solve the case like George Bell did. Nobody will ever know the case as closely as George Bell did. It was like losing one of the few puzzle pieces that they did have.
Are we ever going to know what happened to Jaliek?
I certainly hope so.
Greenwich Police Chief George Bell says the Rainwalker investigation is still very much open and that his department continues to receive leads every week.
Certainly don't believe that a 12-year-old, now being 17, irregardless, could just walk away from his home and just try to live a normal life out there.
There are so many theories in this case, and honestly, I have not seen a single person even acknowledge or play into the fact that Jaliek ran away. You have to keep in mind that this was a young man struggling with a lot, and he was suicidal at times, especially up to the day that he went missing. But the circumstances surrounding that and all of the information surrounding that is just too odd to really consider that he ran away. Even the authorities have said they've entirely ruled out that possibility. If Jaliek had run off to join a gang, it is very, very likely, especially if this letter is true, they needed a foot soldier on the war on drugs, it's very likely that he at this point would have ended up in jail or at least arrested or had some sort of run-in with authorities. And he's a very, very unique looking person. He's got dark blonde to light brownish hair. He's got a really beautiful complexion and these bright green eyes. It's just someone that really stands out, and there was a lot of coverage on this case. And with how quick George Bell was on top of things, I feel like if Jaliek at any point in time ended up in the system anywhere, he would have been found. The idea that he went off to live with another African American family also just doesn't make sense, because how would he have found an African American family that just so happened to want to take in a young man with a lot of special needs? If there were 6 families that were fully capable of taking care of special needs children that had to turn him away, what's the chance that he went to another family that could handle him without him popping up somewhere, without him showing up to get medication or being taken to some sort of doctor? It just doesn't make a lot of sense. And to top it off, a lot of these things that his family claimed are possibilities, he wouldn't have been able to find resources on them. He lived in a house that didn't even have electricity but for a few hours a day. And considering they searched Stephen's father's computer thinking it's possible Stephen wrote that note, that leads me to believe there wasn't even a computer in the home, and I wouldn't really expect one to be in there anyways. And they found even more odd circumstances in regards to Stephen as well. Stephen told authorities the very specific routes that he took that night, and when they triangulated all of this information, he took an entirely different route. Meaning he lied not only about being asleep that night and not going out because his phone was pinging out in the middle of the night, but he also lied about the roads he was on. And I feel like the only reason you would be concerned about people finding out the route you took is if there was something they could potentially find along the way. Now, we don't know. We have absolutely no idea what happened to Jaliek, who did something to him. Because there's such a lack of physical evidence of any kind, I think it is going to take someone cracking in order for the truth to come out about this case. I think it's very likely there is one, if not a few people that know exactly what happened to Jaliek, whether it's being told about it or whether it's having an idea about it. I just definitely think that someone knows. And unfortunately, I think this person might be in the situation where they feel they cannot come forward with this information, whether they don't feel safe or whether they're brainwashed into thinking, you know, they can't. There's absolutely no telling. But it's very, very upsetting to me because it's so clear something very horrible happened to this child, all because he wasn't really given the opportunity to thrive. He wasn't put in the right family situation. He wasn't put in the right environment in general. He wasn't provided the medical help and attention that he needed for his mental health. It's just sick to me because he might have been difficult. He might have been a lot to handle, but there's no telling what he could have been like had he had the right help. And the fact that someone potentially got so frustrated with him that they ended his life is heartbreaking. The foster system and adoption system is such a mess, and the people are overworked, underpaid, and then on top of that, you know, it's just a lot to deal with. It's a ton to deal with, and I unfortunately think that when it comes to him being allowed to be inside this home to begin with, when it comes to him being adopted by this family. I think it's a situation where he was just such a difficult child to place that people just started turning their eye, so they had one less person on their list. And that's sick, because that's not how people should be treated. And unfortunately, authorities paired with every person that's looked into this case, no one really believes he is alive any longer. And at this point, it's just about mainly finding his remains and what exactly happened to him. Whether he did run away because he had just had enough, he didn't want to bounce around to families anymore, or it's like authorities fear the most, foul play happened and this young boy was taken off this planet way too soon and justice needs to be served. Let me know what you guys think down below. This has made me sick to my stomach ever since I first started looking into it. It's definitely not a case that's very quiet. There are a lot of people that know about it, but I think because there's such a high chance that there is someone out there that knows and is just scared to come forward, I think the more you talk about this and bring light to his case and the fact that this young boy did not deserve this. I don't care how bad everyone thought he was. He did not deserve what might have happened to him. I'm hoping this person eventually comes forward. I'm hoping he has a soft spot for them. I'm hoping they finally have a moment of clarity where they decide to come forward so this young man can finally receive some justice. So make sure you share his information anywhere you possibly can. Pressure, pressure, pressure will be the one thing to crack this case. Mark my words. I want to thank you guys real quick for taking a minute to listen to Jaliek's story today. Don't forget to hit the subscription button down below to become a part of the Hallan fam. And I do want to remind you guys that if you have any case suggestions whatsoever, I have a submission form linked in the box down below. It's really easy to fill out. I've been getting a lot of submissions lately through social media, and that's not a great way for me to keep up with them. So the only way that I do accept submissions is in fact through the form. But if you have a family member that is a victim that you would like me to shed light onto, you are more than welcome to email me so it gets to me a little bit faster. I also want to remind you guys, I have thousands upon thousands upon thousands of missing persons cases. I can't remember the exact number now. I know it's well over 4,000. A lot of you guys have been messaging me and commenting lately saying it's taken months now for me to cover your case. It's a lot of cases. I'm going through them as fast as I possibly can, but to give you an idea of how slow I've been working through them because there are so many. I started the submission form in March, I'm pretty sure it was, and I've only reached a couple weeks into March. Also remember that families do take priority over the submission list, so if a family reaches out to me, I'm obviously going to try to do that sooner rather than later, and there have been a lot of changes in the cases since then, since you guys have submitted them, so that could change things, and there also could be moral issues as to why I won't cover a case. If I don't see that it's going to teach a lesson or benefit the case, I'm not going to cover it. So I just wanted to quickly remind you about the submission form and then also kind of update you on how it's going so far. You guys are outstanding. You have suggested so many different cases. I wish I could get every single one as fast as I possibly could. It's just a lot of names and a very, very long process at one video a week. So thank you for hanging in there with me. So I'll go ahead and stop rambling now. I know you guys have probably had enough. Don't forget to go ahead and hit the subscribe button to become a part of the Hallan fam so we can hopefully bring them home together, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye!